Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's November 9th, 2018, and I could not be more excited to have today's guest. I say that a lot, and I absolutely mean it today. Today we have John Hamer in the house. John Hamer, we'll have him introduce himself in a second, but basically, many of you will remember that recently we had Kathleen Melanakis on to talk about Joseph Smith, the Joseph Smith family, to talk about Mormon origins. She was really interested in forgery and counterfeiting. And so we talked a lot about that, but we realized during that episode that we really need in Mormon Stories to dig back into Mormon history. That those are some of our most beloved episodes. Those are most popular. Those are the most needed. And so we're going to do that. I'm working with Dan Vogel now to bring him on Mormon Stories. And I reached out to John Hamer recently because one of the things that Mormonism needs really badly are plausible explanations for, I'm just going to say, I'll start by saying the Book of Mormon. So, one of the things that the church is trying to do is continue this narrative that the Book of Mormon was authored in a short number of days by uneducated people, and that it must be a historical document, because of whatever narrative they have. And recently, the church actually put out a short video for youth that kind of addresses this idea of whether or not the Book of Mormon is historical, etc. And so, what I think would be interesting, and I tried to do this with Kathleen Melanakis, is bring on a few people to give their best attempt at explaining how the Book of Mormon was authored. Now, that's not today's presentation, because you really can't understand Book of Mormon authorship without first understanding folk magic and treasure digging. And so John Hamer has signed up to come on several episodes of Mormon Stories and discuss, at a minimum, this episode, which is going to be about folk magic and the Smith family and, upper state New York and Vermont and all that stuff. We're going to dig into folk magic this time. The next episode is going to be on John Hamer's theory on how the Book of Mormon was authored. We'll bring Dan Vogel on later. We'll have other scholars on. And, of course, we're going to be bringing John Hamer back potentially for other episodes as well, because he's been developing all this amazing content for Community of Christ in Toronto. He has now become a 70 of the Community of Christ. He also is a pastor or a leader of the Toronto Congregation of Community of Christ, and he's been creating all this wonderful content for his community, but he hasn't been sharing it with the rest of us. So, John Hamer, what's going on? Why are you holding out on this amazing content?
You're right. Sometimes you get really focused in on the local stuff that you're doing, and then you are not, anyway. But there is a lot of things. So I have actually done, there's hundreds of hours probably of different additional content and thousands of slides. So I'm on topics I think that a lot of your listeners are going to be very interested in. So there's plenty to share now. So that's exciting.
That's brilliant. Well, welcome back to Mormon Stories. You've been on many times. It's always awesome to have you. Will you give yourself the proper introduction that I didn't do justice to, so people can know who you are, what you do, what your background is, and
Sure.
Then we'll jump right into the presentation.
Yeah, sure. So I've been around, I think, in the post-Mormon community for since it's been online almost, for about 20 years, when, all the way back to exmormon.org, bulletin boards and that kind of a thing. But so I go back in terms of my family joined the movement in 1832, 1833, so 7 generations ago. And I was raised in the LDS church, but not in Utah, so in Minnesota and other places in the Midwest. I left, well, I don't know if you need to know this whole story. I've gone into more detail maybe than I should.
Version, yeah.
Yeah, the short version was when I became a doubting teenager. By the time that I was, let's say, 16 and reading the Book of Mormon, and certainly the Book of Abraham, I had enough information as my historical background to know and to not feel that those were historic, and then that on top of essentially the church's policies regarding race, and sexism, especially gender. I decided when I became an adult that I was done. I wasn't interested in being part of it. And so it was only, and so I went off and went into history and actually studied medieval history in my graduate school. But I also started looking into my own family history, which turns out is, Mormon history. And I found out that the story of Mormon history was so much more interesting than I had been led to believe growing up as a Mormon teenager, and just getting the manualist version, which was just so watered down, whitewashed, white bread, Wonder Bread, that it was just, I found it to be so incredibly dull. It turns out that it's actually amazingly fascinating. I kind of immediately devoured everything. I started going to the Mormon History Association, the John Whitmer Historical Association. I kind of quickly, with my husband Mike, became directors of the John Whitmer Historical Association. And from there, I met, obviously, all of the Community of Christ historians and their incredible community. They were continuously telling me about their church, which I totally didn't believe them that it could be like it was. Because my entire perspective really on churches was growing up in the Mormon church. And so it was only after about 10 years of kind of looking into, wow, they really are serious about all of this stuff, about inclusion, about not being creedal, about being open to truth wherever you find it, about all this kind of authenticity, that I said, okay, well, I have to be part of this thing. It's pretty amazing. So I joined Community of Christ on April 6th, 2010, on the 150th anniversary of the reorganization, 180th anniversary of the organization of the church. And so when I've been kind of devoting my life to this kind of stuff ever since then. So here in Toronto, I serve as chair of our social housing charities. So we're able to address things like the problem of homelessness. We house about 180 people who are poor and have mental health conditions and things like that, who might otherwise not be able to be housed. And we're doing those sort of missional things. So that's kind of my short thumbnail background.
Beautiful. And you're just a lovely, thoughtful human. And I would say one of the most well-versed in Mormon history people that I know. And so you're going to have a hard time finding someone.
That's a very huge compliment, because you know everybody. So
No, I mean, there's Dan Vogel, there's Richard Bushman, there's Michael Quinn. And I would say, different people are going to have different areas of expertise, but I would say you very much belong in that circle. That's my opinion.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, well, Dan, I'm excited that you have him coming on. He is going to have all of the primary sources so much at his fingertips. He wrote all the books on that topic, right? And so he's absolutely an amazing person to have. And so what I'm maybe going to bring here to you is a slightly different synthesis, and hopefully how I can try to explain and make this origin story kind of understandable. Because like you're saying, I think that one of the things that happens in ex-Mormonism is that people have a vision of how the contemporary LDS church in Utah portrays all of the Mormon origins, which is in a very literal way. It's in statues and paintings and movies that is very different from the actual primary source testimony. And so as a result of that, there is a much further leap you have to make in order to try to explain it. And like you say, also there is this attempts to play up the miraculous nature of the Book of Mormon as a composition. That millions of books have been written. It's not, saying that a book has now appeared is not the biggest miracle in the universe that I can imagine. Just we try to stack up against all the other miracles. And then also trying to, at the beginning of his life anyway, later Joseph Smith is talked up as the greatest thing since Christ. But in his origin times, everybody wants to make him out of being just a dumb bumpkin who, is such an idiot. There's no way that he could have produced this particularly ordinary book that, I don't know, anyway. So as a result of that, by making those extremes, I think that people, are confused, tend to be confused, and they want to either make conspiracies. So in other words, to try to address those issues where they want to have all kinds of other people wrote the book and gave it to Joseph Smith, or he stole it from them, and all this kind of thing. And then otherwise, anyway, conspiracies about all of the origins. But I think that if we just look at the actual sources and understand it, we can actually very easily understand what this full narrative is, and understand the people. So,
and just, a lot of times people are going to listen or not listen to someone based on their credibility, the perception of whether they have an axe to grind, the perception of whether they're objective or biased in some way. And you're a bit of a paradox in the sense that, you left the Mormon church,
yes.
but you joined Community of Christ, which is a tradition, a Latter-day Saint, or a tradition based on Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. So you can't really call you anti-Joseph Smith or anti-Book of Mormon, right?
Right. So obviously the Book of Mormon is part of the canon of Scripture and Community of Christ. And I think that the Book of Mormon actually, as 19th century Scripture, and as we understand how it, was written, which I think is pretty clear, how it's composed, that we can get that as a window into biblical canon that is incredibly important in Christianity. So we were just at the Parliament of the World's Religions this last week, which was held in Toronto. It's this thing, it's essentially 7,500 religious leaders from all of the world's religious traditions, descended on Toronto. You guys had the last one you hosted in Salt Lake, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. And so this idea is it's like the World's Fair or the Olympics. It's a thing of an international gathering that rotates city by city. And during this, I was talking to, an evangelical Christian who falls into this this condition that I believe anyway is a problem that evangelical Christianity often gets, of what I consider to be Bible worshiping, where they don't understand Scripture. Scripture is so alien from their encounter. It seems so ancient and all this kind of thing. It is actually an ancient thing. It was written 2,000 to 2,600 years ago. And so as a result of that, they can just assume that it's in this wholly other alien category, and they assume they can read it very, very literally, when it is anything but. And we can show that through the disciplines of history, literary criticism, and archaeology. So we can show things like, for example, that the book of Daniel, the last book of the Hebrew Bible to be written and included in the canon, is written hundreds of years after the mythological figure of Daniel would have existed. It's not written by Daniel. The person who's writing it has very little understanding of Daniel's life. The stories are not, or in actual historical context, they're very aware instead of the time period when they are writing it. And so all of Daniel's prophecies up until that moment, which is in the 2nd century before the Common Era, are spot on accurate. And then 2 years later, they go completely off the rails because the person is not able to predict the future beyond that. And so we were able to see with that component of the canon essentially how literary prophecy in terms of future prediction, which is not what when I would say theologically what prophecy is supposed to be about. But the Book of Mormon, we can see the same exact thing in terms of all of the prophecies that lead up all the way till 1830 are pretty great. They're pretty amazing. Well, in other words, in terms of like being able to predict spot on everything about Christ in the New Testament in ways that no matter how much Christians have always typologically read Isaiah as predicting Jesus, it didn't actually say that it will be born and his mother's name will be Mary and his father's name will be Joseph. In other words, all of these kind of predictions that are, just absolutely the entire narrative as you get in the Book of Mormon, or for example, all the way up to the Anthem transcript issue. Son's story is actually in the Book of Mormon because, and again, it's predicted, but what happens in Nauvoo is not predicted in the Book of Mormon, right?
Yeah. What's not predicted in the Book of Mormon is 3 degrees of glory. What's not predicted in the Book of Mormon is the temple ceremony. Joseph.
The idea of eternal progression theology is not predicted.
Yeah.
You get instead what you get in the Book of Mormon is modalism. So the Father is the Son. So, there is this idea that there is one God, that God is both.
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. Anyway, but the point of it is that my point is that you can avoid in being in a faith tradition that is a Christian heritage tradition and a restoration heritage tradition like Community of Christ. By having this close-hand understanding of Scripture, we can put things like the Book of Daniel into context. We can understand how people in the past, have written sacred story, or as we might want to call it, myth, how they are writing to make theological points. They're not trying to write, they're not actually writing history.
And if I had to tell me if this is an okay summary, you're basically saying the Book of Mormon, even though you view it as a 19th century document, it still has a lot of rich spiritual and even theological value, even if it wasn't, necessarily created in the way that Orthodox LDS church members were taught. Is that what you're saying?
And also I'm saying that as a result, we can also see that none of the books are created in that way.
Right,
in other words,
right.
The way the Bible. Current LDS people are taught that the Book of Mormon is created is not how it was created, and that is also not how the Bible was created.
Right. And we are going to have David Bakavoy on Mormon Stories next week to talk about applying historical criticism, not just to the Old Testament, but also to the Book of Mormon. That'll be fun, right?
Wonderful. Yeah. So, I'd like to talk to you about all kinds of, in future episodes too, about, what we can understand about the historical Jesus and all this kind of thing. I know you've already had some really great experts on that, but anyway, we can talk in some pretty serious detail.
There's Bart Ehrman, and then there's John Hamer, right? So, we got to.
Yeah. So in the same way that Dan Vogel knows
okay. Bart Ehrman's okay, but he's no John Hamer. You know what I mean?
We have different backgrounds. So his background is as a fundamental, originally he, as a fundamentalist. And so when he is looking back at the scripture, he is always deconstructing the fundamentalist Christian understanding and perspective on the Bible, which is different from the Mormon one, right?
Yeah, for sure.
In that sense, he knows, I don't know New Testament Greek. He does, So there's all kinds of things that he knows way more than I do and ever will. And same thing with, like I say, Dan Vogel in terms of all the primary source materials at his fingertips for this particular story, but everybody's bringing their own different parts of the synthesis. So,
well, really quick, we are broadcasting this live on Facebook. Sarah says, "Love John Hamer." Steve Otteson basically says that you're amazing, that your early Mormon Stories episodes were instrumental in him going on a journey as a seeker, ultimately landing in trying out Community of Christ there in Seattle. Huge shout out to the Ottesons. We love you, Steve and family. Steve also says Dan Vogel would be great. Mary's excited about to hear from you, John. And Daniel Lima says, I envy John's hair. How does it feel to be objectified, John Hamer?
As now I'm 48 now, so any compliments I get, so
you'll take it.
At this point, I'm going for a young Ben Franklin.
Really? So everyone who's listening just to the MP3, you will be able to get everything you need from this presentation just through listening. I just want to make sure everyone knows that we also are sharing this on Facebook and on YouTube, because John Hamer, along with being brilliant and a pastor of a church and a 70th Community of Christ and an entrepreneur, business-wise, he also is a graphic designer. He helped with the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He's designed most of the book covers for most of the Mormon-themed books you've probably read over the past few years. And he's developed these incredible PowerPoint slides that he's going to be showing for today's presentation. So if you have the ability to switch to YouTube or Facebook, you will really enjoy John's graphic design. Is that right, John?
Yes, I hope so, yeah.
Okay. So let's launch in. Why don't you switch to PowerPoint, and we'll dig right into this presentation by John Hamer on the use of folk magic with Joseph Smith and early Mormonism.
Okay, so do you got this one?
I see it. Yep.
Okay. So this is, again, like you're saying, I wanted to talk about how I understand the composition of the Book of Mormon, but in so many ways that I think we have to have possibly 2 episodes as background before we can get there. So this one is on the folk magic, and the next one we might want to do is on maybe educational and doctrinal context, that is immediately then reflected in the Book of Mormon. So in this one we're going to talk about essentially the kind of folk tradition that the Smith family come out of. So if I can.
Let's do it. And we talked about this a little bit with Kathleen Melanakis, but we want to get more into it. And you've got a lot to add.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that's always going to happen when a movement grows out of a folk tradition. There is essentially the difference between, let's say, everyday common people, or what peasant culture, or any other kind of things, and let's say the elite culture, or the central tradition, the people that are at the contemporaries who are in the universities, who are writing the newspapers and things like that. And so this is like the difference between essentially the big culture and the little or folk culture. And so for those of us who are now, even though this is our ancestors, we now have gone to universities, we now are engaged in critical thinking and this kind of a thing. In a lot of ways, we have a lot of trouble, looking across this bridge and going back and seeing and having empathy for people who are engaged in folk culture. And we tend to be very dismissive of it. And so one of the things that, more or less has always happened is that what regular people, everyday people are doing, that's not what we hear about when we're reading about the Middle Ages. We don't know anything about what the peasants are doing or thinking. Almost, we're caring what the king and a couple elite bishops and all the people who are actually writing the books, are essentially doing. But so one of the things anyway that has always been going on locally has been essentially belief in and practice of folk magic, including, for example, folk medicine. So here in Joseph Smith's era, this is only the very beginning of the time when Western medicine is starting to develop in a way that actually is achieving good results. So there has been a tradition of medicine in the West from Aristotle and Hippocrates and everybody onward down through the Central Middle Ages that involved, we know of it as essentially things like you're getting out of humor, and it's the four humors, and so that we kind of see it as every single time anybody has a problem that they'll cut you or bleed you or have leeches, and essentially this is based on essentially the traditional medicine. That's actually the elite medicine. But then there's also then all the things that people have locally that are folk remedies. Some of these are based on known properties or things that actually do work, and that kind of thing. A lot of it, folk medicine, is based on, the well-known placebo effect, all the kind of things that you get results because you're paid attention to, that you have hope or faith or any of those kind of things. In a lot of cases, that's what's, and rest. A lot of cases, that was what was necessary for, getting better. Other things, though, that people were interested in, always have been interested in, is essentially divination. And so people have all kinds of different ways they want to do that, reading tea leaves, using dowsing rods.
What's a dowsing rod?
So you can see here in the little description of the guy with a dowsing rod, so, or divining rod. Essentially, you're holding two halves of a rod that comes together.
Like
you walk around.
Right? Like a wishbone?
Yeah, like a wishbone. And you walk around, and at certain moments, you feel it's often done for looking for water, right? So people still will do this. They walk around, and then they want to dig a well. They feel like a tug or something like that, or for whatever reason. And when they do that, they sense that that's the place that they're being guided to dig the water, right?
It's like a Ouija board, right? It's like the Ouija board guiding your fingers to a letter, right?
It's exactly the same kind of magic as Ouija board.
Yeah.
So the Ouija board does the exact same thing. And so that would be the same kind of magic as a divining rod. My grandparents, their life was genealogy and going to cemeteries and finding ancestors. They would use a divining rod to find the tombstones. And whether or not, anyway, I don't know if they're more effective as a result that way, but it could be that, it's concentrating their thoughts in a different way. And so it worked in that way. But essentially, people understand it as actually having some kind of a physical effect because the spirit or something is tugging on the rod, right? And same thing, like you say, with the Ouija board. But there's all kinds of other things, like, so for example, removing curses, love potions, all these kind of effects that people are interested in having happen. And so then there were just different kinds of ways that, folk magic would do all those things.
Can I ask you a question about that category of kind of folk magic?
Yeah.
Talk about presentism and how it does or doesn't fit. I tend to think of like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin as these like Renaissance men who were deists and they were rationalists, and you know, they didn't even think that maybe the New Testament was necessarily divine. So we have Jefferson yanking out, you know, any miracle in the New Testament and creating his own version of the New Testament that's pretty much secular. And so on the one hand, I've got these vision of these founders and these sort of Renaissance men that were in some ways very secular or deistic, and they weren't into superstition and magic, men ahead of their times. And then we've got like our perceptions of people like Martin Harris, and you would want to say that anybody who believed in divining rods or, you know, this sort of thing would be a bumbling fool idiot. You know what I mean? Can you talk about to what extent, how should we or shouldn't we view these historical figures in terms of the prevalence of this folk beliefs in these folk magic ideas, and the terms of how credible or not credible, or whether credibility should even come into the conversation when we talk about people who believed in these things? Because I'm guessing leeching and bleeding and all this stuff, you know, we think of that as stupid now, but maybe really smart people who are really credible believed in a lot of this stuff. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So yeah, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson represent, you know, genius level thinkers in the super elite of the time, right? And so they are definitely, you know, right up there. There are all kinds of other, you know, elite thinkers. You know, let's say if you just even go just a little bit before that, for whom they wrote very serious treatises on what we now think of as things that influence folk medicine, what we think of, but they wouldn't have been, it isn't actually folk medicine. It's more like what we maybe understand, let's say, elite Chinese medicine. So lots of folk Chinese mediciners doing things like acupuncture, but then at the imperial court, there would have been the guy that's writing the the pseudoscientific, whatever the idea for the time period, the level of what they understand, that is like showing all the different kinds of little ways that this acupuncture does this or that, and they're making diagrams, and they're teaching that in the high level of school, whatever they have, their equivalent of a university. In that same way, in the Middle Ages and into the early modern time periods, the kind of medicine that is being taught, you know, is based on the four humors. So whether you are going to be, you know, you have too much blood, so you're sanguine. You have too much black bile or whatever, so you're colic or melancholic. And so we have all of your bilinous, all of these different kinds of qualities that are essentially meant whether or not your humors are out of touch, and they're based on a elemental theory that goes all the way back to Aristotle. So the four elements, air, earth, fire, and water, and you're having too much fire, so you're sanguineous, so you have to have leeches to get some of the excess fire and heat out of you. So that's kind of the elite version of that. But then all of that kind of also peters into what the regular people are doing. They don't all have access to a university-trained sorcerer, you know, essentially, you know, you can have another example of this is, you know, Isaac Newton, you know, wrote just as much about the apocalypse. You know, he believed he had come up with a science of future prediction based on his reading of, you know, the book of Revelation. You know, that so many of these early believers believed in astrology just the same amount as they believe in astronomy. In fact, the whole reason why astronomy and chemistry made it through the Middle Ages is essentially because of people's interest in astrology and alchemy, right? And so it's only been more recently that these have diverged. And so there are very sophisticated thinkers that didn't have access to that information. And then we're going to say, going down to Martin Harris's level, always throughout time, there have always been people that just don't have access to the kind of information. He's just a very normal person. So we maybe think of, you know, some of his contemporaries saw Martin Harris as being, let's say, especially, you know, especially credulous, right? But there's lots of people in his same category, and then there would have been local people that are like the newspaper editor or whatever who are already skeptics because they have access to some of this, and so that's just part of the ongoing, you know, human conversation. But I think that in general, this idea of you know, folk magic in medicine and things like that, it was just much more widespread at that point than it is now. We still do all kinds of things that where we do things that are superstitious or that use the ideas of sympathetic magic. One of the ones that you know, that always is happening is in sports. So people in sports routinely do superstitious stuff about their team being able to win, whether they can't change their socks or anything they're going to do. And almost everybody, whether or not you're actually doing a superstitious thing about like that, almost everybody, when they're watching a game, they're on TV and they actually see somebody, they've thrown the football or whatever, and it's going and it's going, and people will all kind of go this way. In other words, they move, themselves as if, because this is sympathetic magic. So if you do this, you're sense kind of willing the football to go the right way on the screen, even though obviously it doesn't work that way, right? So there's all of these things that are quite deeply ingrained in us, and we shouldn't just look at any of these guys. Martin Harris maybe is, a little more credulous than a lot of other people, but there were lots of people that are like this. So when we're getting to this plate story, the other money diggers, the other sorcerers really believe Joseph Smith has the plates, and they're trying to use sorcery in order to find where he's hidden them so they can get them. They want to get access to them.
So smart people believed and still believe in folk magic. And I think even essential oils today, not that they're,
sure,
they're maybe legitimate, more and less legitimate uses of essential oils, but when people are wanting to use essential oils for healing cancer or that sort of thing,
yeah.
So smart
So
people.
there could be all kinds of factors. Like people, there are very much people with celiac disease who shouldn't be having gluten, but there's a huge phenomenon of everybody thinking the gluten's bad for them based on no real evidence, this kind of a thing. So like you say.
Okay, all right. So smart and dumb people believed in folk magic back in the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
Okay. So one of those things is dowsing rods. And so we know we have accounts of both Joseph Sr., for example, Joseph Smith Sr., and also of Oliver Cowdery, specifically using divining rods for different kinds of revelation, right? And so one of the stories that we have in the early Book of Mormon translation or Book of Mormon composition process is in the Revelation, that says essentially that Oliver Cowdery has, in the edited form, the gift of Aaron, which is to say it was originally the gift with the rod, and that this means, essentially the divining rod. And so then presumably the way that he was going to maybe be able to do his own component of the Book of Mormon revelation process or composition process is through something that was somehow would have been related, like you say, to a Ouija board, because essentially they don't have a Ouija board, and those are invented later, but essentially where the rod is somehow saying yes or no as words are coming to him and he's telling parts of the narrative. Maybe the rod would have said, okay, yes, let's put that in, or okay, no, that's not of God, or something like that. In any event, what Oliver Cowdery found was that he didn't feel that he had the inspiration to do that, but in any event, it's reflected here of this overall belief in different kinds of folk magic. So in this case, divining rods. We also have, for example, our own account, Lucy Smith, talking about the family doing things like drawing magic circles. And the Hiram Smith family, for example, has a whole set of magic talismans that were in the family's possession and continue to be. So,
and what would a talisman be used for?
So,
why would Lucy draw magic circles?
I thought I might have one. I don't have it. So, what are the talismans for? It's things like protection, things like the kind of thing that when people there's ongoing, let's say, folk magic belief in Mormonism about, for example, garments, providing some kind of protection, actual physical protection. I mean, I've heard essentially Mormon folk stories where, like a missionary or somebody is burned up in a plane crash or whatever, but like everywhere where the garments were completely intact, but so what? I mean, their head has been burned off, but anyway, you know what I mean? So this is like a view, though, of trying to show kind of like the folk magic efficacy of, like a particular thing. So a talisman or a magical document can have that same kind of idea, or maybe it's something specifically to some particular goal, like you want to have achieved some kind of an end, and maybe it was drawn up for that kind of a purpose. So in other words, helping you towards achieving something or finding something, like people do this now with manifesting, right? So there's like a big pop movement that if you just, you just envision it, then you will achieve it.
Yeah.
So that same kind of thing. And so in Lucy Mack Smith's story, just as this one of anyway, lots of accounts of this, but it's one that's coming from the mother herself. She says, "Let not my readers suppose that because I shall pursue another topic for a season that we stopped our labor and went at trying to win the faculty of abrac, drawing magic circles or soothsaying, to the neglect of all kinds of business. We never during our lives suffered one important interest to swallow up every other obligation, but whilst we worked with our hands, we endeavored to remember the service and welfare of our souls." And so what she's saying here is that she's aware that people are critical of people who go off and are really focusing on their folk magic pursuits. But she's saying that yes, okay, we were doing that, but it's not because we'd stopped important things about labor, because really, and she's even saying here, service and welfare of our souls, she's tying together folk magic and folk magic pursuits, I think, here with her folk Christian beliefs, which is to say that this is all part of essentially the spiritual life.
Got
Does that make sense?
Yep, got it.
Okay, so we're very aware of, from sympathetic sources, Joseph Smith's use of different magic devices, right? And so one of them being either what was an early called Peep stone, later Seer stones, for what's called essentially the folk magic practice of scrying. And so scrying is the idea of using something like a stone or a mirror or a piece of glass or a crystal ball, so that you can essentially use that to focus a vision. And so it's essentially the same exact practice looking into, we've seen the pictures now anyway, everybody's quite familiar of taking a seer stone and putting it in a hat and looking into the stone. This is essentially the same kind of folk magic practice as the queen in Snow White's using when she goes to mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. And then the mirror shows an image of Snow White, right, instead of the queen. And that makes the queen very mad. So anyway, so in that same way, where are the plates? Where is Captain Kidd's treasure buried? So it turns out then when you're looking in and you're using now not your physical eyes, but your spiritual eyes, and you're looking into the glass, you're looking into the mirror, into the crystal ball, the seer stone, the vision in your spiritual eye, what you envision then is that the Captain Kidd's treasure is buried, at a particular bend of the Susquehanna River, and you kind of are able to narrow it down using that kind of folk magic visionary process in order to access it. And you can also do the same exact thing then for using it to for finding the golden plates when where they're buried exactly. And another one would be using it then in more of a seance-like sense. You can think of maybe later, so seances are a little bit later development, but you can think of that as essentially as people are channeling, or at least they understand themselves to be channeling the other world, right? So either a spirit is talking through them, and as they close their eyes and are using this focus, or they are, or maybe directly to God, so something like that, or a saint,
Yeah, and tell me if you plan on reading, and this will just come out of the blue, the Benjamin Franklin quote on treasure digging. Do you have that in your presentation at some point?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead. And
do you mind if I read that just to give people context?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's so important for people to understand just a couple basic things. One is this Captain Kidd thing, which is that there were these rumors going around that some pirate had buried a bunch of treasure somewhere in New England. And so everybody thought that under them was some buried gold treasure. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, and not only Captain Kidd, so Captain Kidd's pirate's treasure is around somewhere as far as everybody's concerned. Also, there's a sense maybe that De Soto, so the Spanish explorer had buried all his treasure somewhere around there. In other words, they didn't know where he'd gone. He hadn't gone anywhere near New England, but they, people all started assuming that. And finally, this is also the time period, so where this massive craze has happened in Europe and is spread across now to North America, where when Napoleon went and conquered Egypt, Napoleon and all of what, it's essentially pre-archaeology, but essentially all of his Westerners who have access now to Egypt, they dig everything up, they find all, and they loot essentially all of these Egyptian ruins and gold. We get the Rosetta Stone and all these kind of things. And so people suddenly have a mania for ruins of the past civilizations and finding them. And so people in North America are also very much excited about finding ancient North American ruins and North American artifacts and things like that. And one of the things that they're also simultaneously aware of that we don't see anymore is that, because they've all been destroyed, is that all of central North America, all the Midwest and Ontario here and across, are covered with ancient earthworks. And so it's essentially the mounds. And so there's all of these mounds, and it reflects obviously a very densely populated agricultural societies, of which no longer exist at all among contemporary Native Americans in the 19th century. And so they are very eager to dig in those and find the remains of that civilization, and they assume perhaps treasure that's associated with it, the same way that Napoleon got treasure from Egypt.
Yeah, so they're thinking between all these Indian mounds and the tales of Captain Kidd and other explorers, that, if they don't like farming, if they don't like the mundane poverty of, rural New England, or, expanding westward, sort of westward expansion with pioneers and whatever, if you don't like clearing rock out of fields, chopping down trees, all the hard work that would accompany westward expansion and pioneering and civilization, maybe there's a quick treasure to be found that can make you rich immediately to help keep you from having to do all that hard work. Is that fair to say?
Sure. It's a 19th century get rich quick scheme.
Yep. Just like pyramid schemes would be today, right?
Yeah. And people people, like with anything, people really believe in it, right? So they're I think that there's every reason to imagine that Joseph Smith Sr. Really believed he was going to find these treasures and get rich, and that would be how he would deal with it. I mean, they had been in a situation, and their context was that they were a downwardly mobile family. They had money, and they were potentially going to try to go into a next level class thing of being merchants. He lost all of his money on this ginseng speculation that he tried to do. He then was trying to go into farming, which he would have preferred not to do. He was doing it at a very difficult time in Vermont's history, where they had, for example, even the year without a summer because of the volcanic explosion. So 3 successive years of total crop failure, beat out of him probably almost any desire that he had to try to give a go of being a farmer, which I think he probably wasn't as eager about it anyway. And so ultimately, when they do get to a better location in Palmyra and they're giving it a, kind of one last go, ultimately when his creditors are surrounding him, rather than go through the work, like you say, of actually raising a crop and going through and being a farmer, it's at that moment when he still abandons the family and goes on treasure hunts, hoping to get rich quick.
Right. And so let me read this quote from Benjamin Franklin that he would have written sometime in the 1700s. So this is decades and decades before any of the Joseph Smith treasure digging went on. So he says, and this is from the website followtheprophets.com under their section Treasure, Rocks, and Magic. And it says, there are among us great numbers of honest artificers and laboring people who, fed with the vain hope of growing suddenly rich, neglect their business almost to the ruining of themselves and families, and voluntarily endure abundance of fatigue in a fruitless search after imaginary hidden treasure. They wander through the woods and bushes by day to discover the marks and signs. At midnight, they repair to the hopeful spot with spades and pickaxes. Full expectation, they labor violently, trembling at the same time in every joint, through fear of certain malicious demons who are said to haunt and guard such places. So think Moroni, or, guarding the cave or the treasure. Think, the demons appearing when Joseph Smith is praying in the, whatever account of the first vision. These are relics. These parts of the stories we're familiar with are relics from this folk magic lore. Sorry, I jumped out of this quote.
But you're exactly. So what you're showing here is that this is like general context. So even though since Mormons are the only people who kind of tell this story, it always seems like it's this completely unique experience or something like that. But in fact, this treasure digging was a mania. So and it's something that, like you say, even decades earlier, people like Benjamin Franklin are complaining about. That common people are being susceptible to a get-rich-quick scheme that's involving essentially belief in a folk magic, that you would be able to use folk magic in order to counter the folk magic that's hiding or cursing the the location of the treasure, and you can get at this kind of buried treasure.
Right. And just to finish, it says, "At length a mighty hole is dug, and perhaps several cartloads of earth thrown out, but alas, no keg or iron pot is found, no seaman's chest crammed with Spanish pistols or weighty pieces of eight. Then they conclude that through some mistake in the procedure, some rash word spoke, or some rule of art neglected, the guardian spirit had power to sink it deeper into the earth and convey it out of their reach." Now, just really quickly to kind of to kind of conclude, that this is, I think of the movie The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman, and they're mad at this Irish gangster guy who's killed one of their friends, Luther, and so they're going through what are the scams that we can consider so that we can pick one to punish this mean gangster guy. And so they're going through, well, we can do roulette, we can do card tricks, we can do the wire, which has to do with horse races and a telegraph. And they're going through well-known scams of the time by scammers. And I think it's fair to say that treasure digging was one of the well-known scams of the time for scammers. Is that fair to say or not fair to say?
Well, so it's completely possible, that this is where a lot of the people are at. Although the particular kinds of, like, let's say, organized crime scam that you're talking about also involves a very deliberate attempt, like those guys in The Sting are trying to do. They know that they're doing this as a very deliberate conspiracy or scam, whereas I actually think that we can see that a lot of these people who believe in folk magic actually believe that they believe all those things that you're talking about.
Right. So, like, that's what makes it tricky, is sometimes they believe it.
Right. And so, I mean, I know that it's hard for us, because it's much easier for us to write a story like The Sting, because we you can understand essentially that a person, is trying to deliberately deceive people in order to have particular gain. But it's a lot harder for us to believe or to understand people who have these very crazy folk magic beliefs from our perspective, right? And so in that sense, I think that, whereas, okay, you can make the argument that at the heart of each one of these, if this is your kind of view of it, there is like a guy who is kind of like that guy from The Sting, who is deceiving everybody else in the whole company. But I think that it's actually just probably even more likely, is in peasant culture like this, that the practitioner actually is a believer. They just are aware of more of how you actually make the sausage. So in other words, it's not that they don't like sausage or eat sausage, but whatever, they know more what goes into it.
Okay, so there's two options. One option is that, and we'll get into this, and I just want to see if you can cover it the best you can as we talk about it. One option is the Smith family is knowingly deceiving people. They know there's no treasure. They know that this is a scam, and they're just scamming people out of their money. That's, let's just say, scenario one. Scenario two is they actually believe or think that there's treasure. They actually believe that they're treasure digging. They're actually sincerely gathering other people to search for the treasure. And when it's not found, they're as disappointed as everyone. So that's scenario 1 and 2. And I just want you to.
Well, and scenario 3 is that Joseph Sr. believes it and is severely disappointed. And I think that's pretty clear. but then maybe Joseph Jr. is the scammer, right? So I think that that's one that people also maybe are interested in.
Okay, cool. All right, so keep
Right.
going. I'm sorry. Thanks for this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see if we can do this again. Okay, so the Seer stone. So we have the exact same experience that you just read about decades earlier, Benjamin Franklin complaining about, right? So Joseph Sr. And the money digging companies that he's a part of, we have the contracts of them all receiving shares. We have all kinds of neighbors giving their various affidavit accounts and that about the Smith family, Joseph Sr. and Joseph Jr. being involved in money digging. And in fact, we have court testimony from Joseph's trial about it. So in other words, they're involved in money digging. And in general, as you say, as we read from Ben Franklin there, that money diggers believe that the buried treasure is protected by magic, often guardian spirit, who's able to make the treasure slippery, which causes its underground location to move. So you described that already.
And weren't there dudes coming into Vermont or New York doing this treasure digging that Joseph and Joseph Sr. and even, earlier generations of Smith and Cowdery family members would have had access to?
Oh yeah, this is pretty ubiquitous. I mean, this is something that there's holes all over New England, and it's not just from Joseph Smith and those money diggers. There's all kinds of fellow money diggers that are all doing it, and this is just also one of the things that their particular company is doing. Yeah. So and so, like you say, so they do this thing where you get like essentially however you're going to do it. A seer, for example, like how they would do it in Joseph Smith's company is that Joseph Jr. Is the seer. He uses the stone to look into it. It determines the exact location. When you get that location, then like they're suggesting, you have to do a bunch of particular folk magic rituals in order to fix that location. So you draw a circle. So that you're able to, let's say, keep the guardian spirit from moving it out of the circle, and you have to either appease or thwart the guardian spirit by doing various things, like whatever your particular motives are. Whether, in some cases, there are some, we don't know for sure, but there are some contemporaries said that it might also involve killing an animal and using the blood as essentially a kind of a way to appease the spirit. Whether or not they did that, other folk magicians are doing that kind of a thing. And so anyway, in doing that, and then they start digging at a particular time, like in night or whatever they're going to do. And then when they get to a particular point and they don't actually find the treasure, as is described in the quote you read, they realize or they determine that they've made some kind of mistake in their folk magic ritual, and that the spirit has made the treasure slippery and it has sunk deeper into the earth, right?
Yeah, and we may have rushed over the previous slide, which is the one with the seer stone. I think it's really important to understand that this seer stone, because it comes in later with the Book of Mormon, the idea of a seer stone Joseph got from Sally Chase, one of his neighbors, right?
Sure. Yeah. So absolutely. So like you're saying here, Joseph and many of his neighbors, I didn't read that, I guess, like Sally Chase used peep stones or seer stones for scrying. So, and there's other people using these kind of scrying stones. It's like we've
What's
just
scrying? What's scrying?
Scrying is this folk magic practice of looking into a crystal ball. And
kind of like the evil wizard in Lord of the Rings, right? Saruman, or whatever.
Yeah. So Saruman has a whatever it's called, a planeteer, and so it's like a big crystal ball where he's able to see everywhere because he has that. And Denethor has one of those too. So anyway, so there's a couple of them in that. It's not that Tolkien made that up.
Right.
It's not that seer stones only exist with Joseph Smith. I mean, I mentioned an example is like the Queen in Snow White. It's gypsies we think of as a common example of people with a seer stone. So in some cases, it may be that in those kind of things, in carnivals and things like that, that really is you maybe are deceiving the people around you. On the other hand, even in the cases of things like like gypsy culture or something like that, there is probably a belief in folk magic. It's just a matter of how much the person, again, as who's the practitioner of the folk art, they maybe know more of what goes into it and have a more nuanced view of it, and also they also have to figure out how to live with disappointment when some of their scrying doesn't work, right? So they have ways that they explain it to themselves just as much as they explain it to those around them.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been reading Dan Vogel's book, and he thought Sally Chase's stone was so cool. Did she give him one, or did he find one in her well or something? Isn't that what happened?
So this particular one, I think I got a slide somewhere on it, but anyway, this particular one is from the Chase property. So essentially they're digging a well, or probably money digging, maybe it was hard to know. Anyway, and while they're digging, they say it's for a well. While they're digging, they get a hold of the brown stone. And so in that sense, it's like belongs to, the Chases believe it belongs to them. And at some point or other, they return, the Smiths return it to them, but then Hiram goes and asks for it back. And at a certain point, Willard Chase wants to get it back, and Hiram says, well, you're not going to get that one back. This kind of a thing. So,
yeah,
and that's the Chase version of the story.
They believe the stone has power. And
right.
Later in the story, Joseph goes off on his own. And as I read the book in Vogel's book, he goes off for a day and disappears on search for a second magic stone. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So I think there's a sense that, and there's also testimony that we have that that people have, heard from Joseph Smith Sr. that every person has one of these stones that's attuned to them. In other words, that you can't look into Joseph Smith's seer stone and actually see anything with it because it's attuned to him, but you can,
of course, right?
Yeah, you can look into Sally Chase's stone though, maybe, and she can see where yours is, and then you can go find your stone, and then that stone through different kind of folk rituals can be attuned to you and that kind of a thing, right?
Katie Smith writes, I want one. So
yeah.
Katie wants her own stone.
I should have had, I have one. I forgot to bring it.
Is it magic? When you look into it, do you see things?
So the way it works, in terms of seeing things, is that the way you can envision things is with, again, your spiritual eyes. So you close your eyes, and if we were to all do this, if we all closed our eyes, and I say, I see, a brilliant, sunrise right now above the ocean and things like that. Do you see the sun coming up over the ocean?
I see it. I see the sun coming up over the ocean, yeah. John.
So now you have envisioned that.
I see it. I can see it.
So anyway, so you can do spiritual practices of led meditations, of led kind of shared visions and things like that. You can also, depending on your own folk metaphysical understanding, you may well think, or you may well believe that different kinds of envisioning have, an extra or supernatural source. And so certainly people who believe in folk magic believe in all sorts of different ways of the supernatural encountering our lives. And so one of the things that they are definitely, have a sense of is that there is a veil that is separating our normal unenchanted physical world from essentially the spirit realm, where all sorts of, essentially in the Middle Ages, all sorts of fairy things are happening, or spirit things, or ghost things, and so you can, if the veil from your physical eyes is lifted and you see into that spiritual realm, you would see all of the spirits and everything like that are all around, that are affecting everything. And so that's their understanding, I think, of the visionary, And so anyway, so my belief is that you can do that kind of envisioning, but in fact, it's not. So if you were encountering anything, if you want to say anything that this is actual inspiration, I would argue theologically that this is inspiration that is open to everybody at all times. So as opposed to a communication that's a supernatural that is coming uniquely to you in this particular way. So, but that's my own theological argument. So,
got it. Okay, so this is all in the soup of Joseph Smith's upbringing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's all over.
Okay.
So we mentioned here, yeah. So they have the money digging and thwarting the guardian spirits and the slipperiness of the treasures. And so, in addition to the quote that you read about how this is ubiquitous in North America, it also figures into just the literary components of the Book of Mormon. So the story in the Book of Mormon, the narrative in a couple places, it talks about this very thing occurring in the Book of Mormon text. So from the Book of Mormon in the Book of Mormon 1, 19 to 20, or the LDS versification is 1, 18 to 19, is, and these Gadiant and robbers who were among the Lamanites did infest the land, insomuch that the inhabitants thereof began to hide up their treasure in the earth. And by the way, this is also a mythological basis for the belief that is prevalent here, that how all these treasures that they've been seeking all this time actually do exist, because now they're creating the source of the story for where the treasures got buried in the first place. So they began to hide up their treasures in the earth, and they became slippery because the Lord had cursed the land. So there's a magic curse here. The treasure is slippery. They're no longer able to be in the place where they buried them, that they could not hold them nor retain them again. They go to dig it back up into the exact same place, and it's not there. And it came to pass that there were sorceries and witchcrafts and magics, and the power of the evil one was wrought upon all the face of the land, even unto the fulfilling of all the words of Abinadi and also Samuel the Lamanite. So it's even directly connected here with sorcery and witchcraft, which is to say, anyway, the negative components. I think usually people believe that when they're doing their treasure digging that they're trying to use white magic or whatever, but in any event, it's folk magic, and it's all interconnected with essentially religion. So even though we try to make this firm distinction between it, the Lord is cursing the land, there's a curse, there's witchcraft, the earth is slippery, the treasures are not, are slipping around, right?
Yeah, this is either Joseph Smith writing this folk magic that he participates in into the Book of Mormon, if you believe the Book of Mormon was written by Joseph Smith or others, or God believes that treasure that's buried can be guarded by angels and be removed anytime and slipped away, right?
Right. And so in that sense, if you want to have it that direction, then all of this treasure digging and money digging and everything like that, and the guardian spirits and things like that, and the captain kits, all of that is all legitimate activity that Joseph and the Smith family have been doing, because this is how the universe works, right? Because it's right here in the Book of Mormon.
Yep.
Okay. So here's some of those magic papers that I was mentioning that are in the Hiram Smith family. So this is just going back to this point. Modern educated people are very skeptical that uneducated folk actually believe in folk magic, but I think that there's not very much reason to doubt that Joseph Smith Sr. was a very superstitious person. So I think if you, all of the things that we have of his writings, if you read through, for example, the patriarchal blessings that he dictated, which talk lots about magic all the time, predicting that people will have various kinds of magic powers. We have people, his neighbors who attested all kinds of things that he's trying to essentially tell them about things like money digging, or about how to use divining rods. And so when one of these neighbors who is very skeptical of all this folk magic kind of thinks that there's all a humbug and there's nothing to it, Joseph Sr. says, well, I saw you were using the rod and I thought I saw it wiggle. So, I feel like it is working and you're just not giving it, so that, and certainly one of the things, that we have as an example is the degree to which, if what he's doing, if Joseph Sr. anyway, what he was trying to do in the money digging was to defraud people out of money so that he wouldn't go bankrupt, he is certainly, if that was his motive, he certainly was a complete failure, because what he ends up doing is going bankrupt. And so he is actually, at the end of this whole process, when the Book of Mormon gets going, he's, essentially been arrested for unpaid debts. So he doesn't actually succeed in doing that, and in fact seems to be hopeful that he'll actually be able to find the treasure, I think.
But you also get this sense from the Vogel's book that he was an alcoholic, that he was shameful about that, and that Lucy had to always be doing arts and crafts to sell to kind of keep the family afloat. And then it was Alvin's turn, and Hiram and Joseph, to make the money, because Joseph Sr. was just sort of a ne'er-do-well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. So I don't think that, so it is a problem, but that doesn't, so the fact that he's an alcoholic and is a ne'er-do-well, I don't think that means that whether or not he believes or doesn't believe.
Yeah, and you're saying he does believe and that if this is just a scam, he really
Well, yeah.
because he's not.
So he could potentially, you can argue opposite, like you say, that he is a scam artist who's just really bad at it. So, but I believe that, from having read a bunch of the stuff of it, I think that one of the components of him being a ne'er-do-well is that he has a worldview that doesn't actually produce the results that he believes it will.
Right.
So in other words, he believes that he'll get rich quick and have a treasure and not have to do all these things and, like farm. But in fact, he doesn't end up having that happen.
Right. It doesn't work. Okay.
So, and so anyway, that's what I'm going to say is that I've said this, I've already said it a couple of times, but the practitioners of folk magic actually often believe, as opposed to some of the con artists, although con artists sometimes also con themselves first. And so I do think that sometimes a used car salesman that seems to constantly be lying. An example would be potentially in your country, the head of your state right now seems to have a problem telling the truth. Does he aware of it, or has he lied so much to himself that he's forgotten where the truth is, right? So that could also be true for con artists.
Apologies to my Republican conservative.
So anyway, that's just
John Hamer's editorial comments do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Open Stories Foundation or Mormon Stories Podcast. No, I'm kidding.
We won't say anything further. So, but what I'll say is then, the man holding the dowsing rod. My grandparents, when they were dowsing for finding ancestor graves, they believed that the dowsing rod worked. I believe they believed that. They weren't trying to scam me as a grandkid. I don't think, so
your
anyway.
Your grandparents believed in this.
What?
Your grandparents believed in this.
Yeah. There's all kinds of people believe in all kinds of, I meet people all the time who come here in Toronto who believe all kinds of things that I consider to be folk magic stuff, about energy fields, about coincidences as signs, and all kinds of different things that are still quite prevalent today.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they're telling it to scam me. I think that they earnestly believe a lot of this stuff. Right.